Let's continue looking at the skeletal system and talk about bone growth and development. There are two types of ossification: intramembranous ossification and endochondral ossification. Intramembranous bones are those bones that are flat, like bones of the skull, the clavicles, the sternum, and some of the facial bones develop this way. You have the sheets of connective tissue that is pretty much unspecialized as it starts at the sites of the future bones. It's supplied by a dense network of blood vessels to supply the cells that are present with what they need. The connective tissue cells collect around the blood vessels in these layers. The connective tissue cells differentiate into osteoblasts, which deposit spongy bone. Now, within this connective tissue, there are what we call progenitor cells, and progenitor cells are a type of stem cell that are dedicated in developing into only a certain or limited number of types of cells, and bone cells are the type of cells that these will change into or differentiate into. Osteoblasts that build bone deposit the spongy bone. So you have connective tissue with cells that differentiate into osteoblasts that deposit the spongy bone where there was connective tissue. The osteoblasts surround themselves in a bony matrix, and once the osteoblast is surrounded by the non-living matrix, it converts to an osteocyte, which is a mature bone cell that lies in that depression called the lacuna. The connective tissue on the surface of the developing structure forms the periosteum, as we've talked about before. And right underneath the periosteum, you have more osteoblasts that will continue to form the bone by depositing the compact bone on top of the spongy bone. The second type of bone ossification or bone development is with endochondral bones, which are most of the bones of the skeleton developed by in this fashion. You start out with a cartilaginous model, hyaline cartilage. You have masses of hyaline cartilage that forms the future bone, the blueprint for the future bone. The cartilage begins to break down this tissue, and as it's breaking down, the periosteum forms on the outside of the bone, and then you have calcification of the cartilage going on. Blood vessels form, and you have a very elaborate network of blood vessels here to nourish all the living cells of the bone. And then you have differentiation from those cartilage cells into osteoblasts that form the periosteum, and then it invades the disintegrating cartilage and begins the ossification of that cartilage. The osteoblast forms the spongy bone at the ends of the bones and in the medullary cavity, the space that's occupied by the cartilage. The osteoblasts, as soon as they are surrounded by that non-living matrix again, they are converted from osteoblast into osteocytes and lay in a lacuna. The osteoblasts that are found underneath the periosteum will form or deposit compact bone on top of the spongy bone. Now, as that bone is ossifying, you have lengthening of the bone. Remember that the end of the bone is the epiphysis, and the shaft of the bone is the diaphysis. The epiphyseal plate, or as some pronounce it, the epiphyseal plate, is considered the growth plate, and it is present as long as that bone is lengthening. It's technically a type of joint. You have the first layer of the cell here's the epiphysis here, and then you have a layer of resting cells that anchors the epiphysis to the bone and anchors the epiphyseal plate to the epiphysis. You have the second layer of cells, many rows of young cells undergoing mitosis, rapidly dividing, and as they're dividing, it's lengthening this bone. The intracellular material then causes the disc to thicken, and as it thickens, it is actually lengthening that bone. The third layer of cells are older cells. They're enlarging and becoming calcified, and as they become calcified, the osteoblasts secrete the calcium phosphate that calcifies around this bone, around these osteoblasts, and the cells begin to die as they become calcified. Now, not all the cells will die. Some of them will convert from osteoblasts to osteocytes as they are enveloped in the non-living matrix and in the lacuna. The fourth layer of cells are dead cells that are calcified, and you have the extracellular matrix that's formed. The osteoblasts are depositing this tissue. These are dead cells, the older cells, and then those undergoing mitosis, the resting cells, and there's the epiphysis. It's all part of this joint called the epiphyseal plate. The osteoclasts break down the calcified cartilage. Osteoclasts. Now, we talked about osteocytes. We've talked about osteoblasts. Osteocytes are your mature bone cells. Osteoblasts deposit bone in the place of the calcified cartilage, but osteoclasts help to break down bone, help to break down this calcified cartilage. So remember, we said there were three types of bone cells: the osteocyte, which is the mature bone cell; the osteoblast, that helps to build bone by depositing the calcium phosphates and the inorganic substances; and then the osteoclast helps to break down this inorganic substances, calcified cartilage in this case. Now, what are some of the factors affecting bone development, growth, and repair? Nutrition, nutrition, nutrition is very important. Getting enough vitamin D and calcium and other vitamins, but vitamin D helps you form strong bones utilizing calcium. Calcium is needed for many metabolic processes in the body, but we need calcium for strong bones. So you need to take in enough calcium so that you have strong bones and have enough for all these other metabolic processes that are going on within the body. Hormones will affect a number of things. Growth hormone, the lengthening of that bone, the developing and lengthening of that bone. If you do not have enough of growth hormone, then it will affect the lengthening of the bone and maybe seal that growth plate before it's time to. Same thing with androgens, which are sex hormones. Calcitonin. Now, we'll mention all of these a little bit later on when we talk about the endocrine system. But calcitonin is a hormone that is released that kicks those osteoblasts into action. If you take in enough calcium for all the things that are needed, the calcium that's needed for the body, if you have enough calcium, then extra calcium is deposited on the bones by osteoblasts with the help of the hormone calcitonin. Now, if you don't have enough calcium in the bloodstream, then there is another hormone that is called PTH hormone or parathyroid hormone that actually kicks into action the osteoclasts. that breaks down the bone and deposits that calcium into the bloodstream, so the calcium can be utilized in another part of the body where it's needed. So it takes it, it robs it from the bones. So calcitonin helps with depositing calcium on the bones and for strong bones, and PTH for the breaking down of bone. It's called resorption, where the bone is broken down and that calcium released to the bloodstream so that it can be utilized wherever it's needed. So that's part of one of those homeostatic mechanisms that if you have enough, then it goes either way. All the time it's going either way. But if you have too much, it's deposited on the bones, and then with the help of calcitonin. If you have too little in the bloodstream, then PTH kicks in and osteoclasts to break down the bone and introduce the calcium to the bloodstream so it can go to where it's needed. Physical exercise will strengthen bones, and sometimes appositional growth, which is thickening of the bone. So you have strengthening and thickening of the bone with physical exercise. Now, if you are looking at the PowerPoint, I am skipping a few slides here. We covered the organization of the skeleton in lab, and so I'd like for you to look at those videos when we went over the skeleton in the lab. I want to just very quickly go over the classification of joints. They're classified as fibrous joints. The dense connective tissue connect the bones. It's between bones in close contact, like in between those flat bones of the skull. A suture is a type of fibrous joint. Cartilaginous joint is where you have hyaline cartilage or fibrocartilage that connect the bones. You have that intervertebral disc that separate the vertebrae of the vertebral column or the spine. The hyaline cartilage, you have the attachment of ribs to the sternum with cartilage, so that's a cartilaginous joint. And then the most complex type, the synovial joint, is the most complex, allows for the most movement, and most of the joints of the body are synovial joints. Now back up here to cartilaginous joints, you also have like the symphysis pubis, the pubic bone of the coxa that comes around to the front, the hip bone that comes around to the front. A pad of cartilage is found there that is called the symphysis pubis, and that is also a cartilaginous joint. Now, synovial joint is the most complex type, and let's just go over this real quick. We went over this in lab. Let's go over it one more time for lecture. There is articular cartilage at the end of long bones, and let me say this. We talked about the periosteum that forms on the outside of this long bone. Periosteum is found everywhere that on the outside of this bone except for where there is articular cartilage. With age or injury to that joint, when this hyaline cartilage disintegrates or breaks down or is damaged, if you lose that cartilage and say you need surgery to remove or repair that cartilage and it gets thinner, it will eventually break down if you've had surgery or injury to it, and with age it becomes thinner. And if you lose this articular cartilage here, then you don't have any periosteum to make this bone stronger. That's just spongy bone under there. So you have periosteum on the outside of this bone everywhere but where you have articular cartilage or hyaline cartilage. And remember, articular cartilage is found at the end of the bones that articulate with another bone at a joint. You have a joint capsule here. This ligament, remember ligament bind bone to bone. Here's this ligament, and it forms this joint capsule. Now inside of this joint capsule you have the synovial membrane. The synovial membrane produces synovial fluid. The inner layer of the synovial membrane produces synovial fluid. Now the synovial fluid plays several roles. There are living cells in that cartilage called chondrocytes, chondrocartilage, but the living cells that are in that cartilage are need nutrients. It needs oxygen, and so the synovial fluid will provide that cartilage, which by the way is avascular. It does not have good vascularity. It does not have blood vessels. So those living cells in that cartilage need a way to be nourished and get rid of metabolic waste. So the synovial fluid will provide the nutrients there. Now, if you injure this joint, as I mentioned just a few minutes ago, if you injure this joint, there will be an immune response and swelling, inflammation. And any time that there's injury or maybe infection in that joint, this synovial fluid also can play a role in the immunities or the immune system, and it has macrophages in it, which are these like white blood cells, these cells that will engulf invading organisms and destroy them. Or if you have debris from injury to the cartilage or whatever, and you have things that need to be broken down in this joint capsule in this area where this synovial fluid is, then this synovial fluid can resorb some of the debris or the microorganisms that invades. So this membrane produces the synovial fluid, but it also can reabsorb it. And if it is where it can be broken down, this synovial fluid, with the help of the macrophages, can break down things. Now, if it's too large and the debris stays in this joint, it is going to become inflamed, because that is considered to our immune system as like an invading organisms. It's something that's there that's not supposed to be there. It's a foreign object, a foreign body that our body's not recognizing. So there's an inflammatory response. Now, the most complex of the synovial joint is the knee joint. Now, we talked about this. This is the distal epiphysis of the femur, the proximal epiphysis of the tibia. Now, these do not touch. We have the synovial fluid in between them. Now, the knee has to carry the weight of the entire body. It is the most complex of the joints, and because of the wear and tear on that knee, it has connective tissue, the meniscus here, that provides more stability to this joint. You have the hyaline cartilage at the end of those joints, the articular cartilage, but you also have the meniscus, or menisci is plural, and the meniscus here helps to stabilize this joint. Now, the ends of these bones are complementary to each other, so that if they were to touch, they would sort of fit together. And the ends of these bones would fit together with the meniscus because they're all complementary to each other. But they should never touch. You should still have this synovial fluid in between those joints. Okay, so the meniscus here helps to stabilize the knee. If you've ever heard of somebody tearing their meniscus, that's what they're talking about. So in this joint, here we have the joint capsule again, and here we have the synovial membrane that produces the synovial fluid. Now, this area where there is this joint capsule with the synovial membrane, this area is called bursa. And here's another little bit of bursa here. It is a cavity with synovial fluid that's lined with synovial membrane. Now, you will see adipose tissue here and adipose tissue below the kneecap. Here's the patella, which is that sesamoid bone that articulates with the distal femur and is anterior to the proximal epiphysis of the tibia. Okay, so here's the bursa, and here's bursa with the menisci. Those are additional structures found in some joints. Not all joints have bursa, but the more complex ball and socket joint and the knee joint here have bursa. Now, joint disorders, sprains, usually are caused by damage to the cartilage, ligaments, and tendons associated with these joints. Because cartilage, ligaments, and tendons are pretty much avascular, they do not have a good blood supply, they don't repair very easily, and they don't have very good memory. So once you stretch out a ligament by spraining your ankle, say, by forceful twisting of the joint, then the likelihood of another sprain is pretty high, because the ligaments, once they're stretched out, tend to remain stretched out. The more you stretch it, the less likelihood it's going to go back to its normal length. So anybody who has sprained their ankle, twisted their ankle several times, knows that each time that you do it, it's a little more easily done next time. Tendons, remember, tendons attach muscle to the bones, ligaments, cartilage. Okay. Bursitis is inflammation of the bursa, and that's usually from overuse of the joint. Arthritis causes inflamed, swollen, painful joints. There are 3 basically different types of inflammation of the joints. Rheumatoid arthritis is considered a immune disorder, so you would go to a rheumatologist and they would treat. It's usually inherited or hereditary disorder, rheumatoid arthritis, swollen and painful, inflamed joints, and it causes disfiguring of the joints, also excessive calcium deposits, so forth and so on. And osteoarthritis is from wear and tear of the joint, either from sports injuries or excessive use of the joints or just age. So osteoarthritis comes with age. Rheumatoid arthritis is pretty much inherited. Gout is another condition that causes inflamed, swollen, painful joints, and usually that is caused by excessive uric acid. Okay, that's our look at the skeletal system. Now again, I skipped over a few slides of this PowerPoint presentation. Review back over those slides. Review back over the video that we did in lab that showed the organization of the skeleton, and we named the bones. Go back and review over the names of the bones, the type of joints, and the movements allowed in those joints. And those are the slides that I skipped here. So go back and review over those from your textbook, from the PowerPoints, and from the video that we did in the lab.